and the moment has come to take you to Berkeley Smith at the Victoria Memorial in front of the Queen's London home, Buckingham Palace.
Riding in the gold coach of state, her husband at her side, comes Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. By the grace of God, Queen of this realm and of her other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith.
These were the live pictures that began a new kind of relationship between the royal family and the nation. The coronation of Elizabeth II, watched by millions of her people in their homes on television. It was perhaps the event that made television respectable. It was certainly the first time that television's audience for a great occasion was bigger than radio's. But this wasn't the first coronation live on television. In 1937, cameras followed the procession of King George VI. The engineer in charge then was Tony Bridgewater.
Because of the hurry, the short time scale in which to produce a unit in about 4 months, nothing more could be done in the way of design or layout or facilities except to duplicate the equipment we already had in the studio. EMI worked very hard in manufacturing what we called a mobile control room and managed to deliver it. I can't remember exactly, but it was certainly not more than 48 hours before we were due on the air, which was very alarming. There was no producer appointed at all. I think the philosophy then was that here's an event that's passing by, all you have to do is to point cameras at it. So I was virtually in charge of the production, and we chose the cameras by the simple method of myself standing on the steps of the van, surveying. I could see from there where it was parked, the procession coming down from Marble Arch along the East Carriage Drive. And I would simply say to the vision mixer inside, well, I think now I'd try camera 2, Dougie, you know, or now back to 1, there's something's coming along, the horses are in sight now, you can get the more general view, and so on. But it was a sort of informal way, but seemed to work.
After the outbreak of the war, the outside broadcast, well, the scanners, the control vans, we had 2 units, had been degutted. The equipment had just been hacksawed out because the vehicles were required for other purposes. And after the war, all right, the equipment had to be put back in again. And another chap and myself spent a very interesting, very informative several months doing just this job. The first OB, which was on the books, of course, was the Victory Parade in the Mall. And we certainly got it together in time for that.
In those years immediately after the war, outside broadcast cameras were at many notable events. In 1947, they followed the wedding procession of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip, though live pictures were banned inside Westminster Abbey. The pictures viewers saw were actually clearer than this. The technique of recording live pictures was just beginning, and this was only the second tele-recording ever made. By the late 40s, television had established its annual coverage of the service of remembrance at the Cenotaph. In 1952, television witnessed another solemn occasion, the funeral procession of King George VI, 15 years after they'd brought those pioneering pictures of his coronation. Now another coronation was being planned, and the BBC set up a team to prepare the biggest outside broadcast ever attempted. Leading the team was Peter Dimmock on the left, and his boss, Seymour Joly de La Binière, known to everyone as Lobby.
Lobby and I sort of sat down and talked about it at great length before we began to decide how we were going to deploy our troops. And the main thing was to get as much equipment together as we could. I mean, equipment from beg, borrow, or steal it. That was the prime objective.
Well, the scope was almost as large as we could offer the producers. In other words, it involved all our equipment. They would have liked more. that we called in our equipment, which by this time we were already deploying in the regions at places such as Birmingham, Glasgow, elsewhere. All this came to London, together with everything we had in London previously.
Second objective was to cover the procession for as much of the route as we could, and then, of course, ideally, to be given permission to televise the service in the Abbey. And that was quite a drama in itself, because the first decision was no television beyond the choir screen.
This was, I'm pretty certain, on the whole, because there was an anxiety that this might throw an unnecessary strain on the young Queen, and, if you like, that something might go wrong that couldn't be edited out.
We knew that we could be trusted. We also knew that it would be an enormous disappointment to the nation not to see the Queen crowned live at that moment. And so I'm afraid, we did everything. We lobbied the government, we lobbied the Duke of Norfolk, we lobbied the Archbishop of Canterbury.
There was Thomas Fife Clarke. He was advisor to the government at the time and the Prime Minister on public relations, and he had to go into all this. And I'm pretty certain he made up his mind that this was something that had to be done, in spite of his betters thinking otherwise. And there came a moment when they took this decision, and the announcement was made that our cameras were not to go beyond the choir screen. But he added to it, and I'm almost sure he told me he did this deliberately, that the Queen had only made this decision on the advice of the Cabinet. And he felt dead sure that there'd be such an outcry that Winston Churchill and his Cabinet wouldn't really be prepared to take the kick. And this, in fact, happened. And also, I think Churchill must have realized himself what a tremendous opportunity was being missed for the people who could get near television sets.
After the go-ahead, Dimmock set up a control room in the Abbey and positioned his cameras. Pictures from there and from other units along the processional route were fed back to a central coordinating point at Broadcasting House, where Lobby and Tony Bridgewater were in charge.
Half an hour before the whole thing was due to start, all the things went dead. There was nothing coming back from anywhere. And I could feel engineers all around me going in every direction. And at the time, minutes ticked by, and I thought, what is going to happen? And then somebody discovered that one of the engineers had kicked a lead out by mistake. That only needed putting it back, and we were in business again.
Well, I was on that memorial outside Buckingham Palace. The Ministry of Works sort of built a great wedding cake over the top of it with scaffolding and plywood and so on, and we degutted our control van, put all our equipment inside, and I think it was Barclay Smith and I sat, for it was light really, early in the morning, all day there on this island. It was an exciting day for us because we had the first, when the carriage came out, the very first pictures we were going to get of it were from our unit. And we knew if we got off to a good start, it tends to run through the unit. If we got off to a bad start, that would also have the same effect.
But of course it started magnificently well. These pictures were seen live by more than half the population of Britain and by people in 4 European countries. Tele-recordings were flown to the Commonwealth and America.
Well, I was one of course, many producer-directors involved in the coronation. I personally was directing cameras, I think I'm right in saying only 2, on the embankment, surrounded by 60,000 screaming schoolchildren, and my commentator was Max Robertson.
And at last the coach, for which all eyes have been waiting and all cheers as they give forth full-throated.
It was a awe-inspiring occasion, a very frightening occasion for a junior producer like myself.
At the Abbey, the mood changed. and waiting to describe the scene and the atmosphere as only he could from his vantage point high above the Triforium was Richard Dimbleby.
Here in the Abbey Church of St. Peter, Westminster, a great congregation of 7,000 come from every part of the world awaits the arrival of Her Majesty. And we'll see very shortly the procession as it passes right up the great church of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. And as the Queen Mother enters, and later the Queen, they will see spread out before them this great building in all its magnificence. But first of all, the nave, crowded to its uttermost capacity with distinguished visitors brought from every part of Britain. And then the massive carved oak screen which supports the organ screen through which the Queen Mother and the Queen will pass as they move in slow procession through the dark archway and into then the light of the Coronation Theatre that lies beyond the choir. And as they pass into the Coronation Theatre, there before them will lie the great altar with all its massive plate arrayed upon it, the assembly of the bishops who sit waiting on the north side of the sanctuary, and the splendor of the eastern end of this great church.
I don't think any of us had expected it to be done quite so well as it was. That shot from high up in the Abbey, so they were all walking in, which they kept using. None of us had expected anything quite so impressive as that. And Richard Dimbleby's commentary, too, was absolutely in key. It couldn't have possibly have been done. Nobody at the time could imagine it better done.
My main difficulty was to get a camera head-on for the crowning. And there literally was nowhere apart from suspending it in the air. And then suddenly I thought, well, supposing I could put it in the orchestra. I talked to he's now Sir William Mackay about it, and he was very helpful and said, well, if you get permission, I think we could manage it. So we were able to cut a hole and stand Bud Flanagan, who was the smallest cameraman we got on OBs at the time, and we stood him in there, and he wore his white tie and tails, and then we hit the camera and covered it with cloth that matched.
We started and the service started, and, the musicians got underway and the conductor got underway, and as he got underway and got enthusiastic with his baton, every time he brought it down, that was on top of me, who was sat below him, and I was rather glad when the music stopped. But it was a wonderful day, the colour and the splendour and pageantry. You could see down into the stalls and the Knights of the Garter and all the ermine, all the robes. A wonderful experience.
Now, with the great officers, the Archbishop moves to the south, faces the Duke of Edinburgh, the other princes of the blood, and the massed assembly of the peers.
Sirs, I here present unto you Queen Elizabeth, your undoubted Queen. Wherefore all you who are come this day to do your homage and service, are you willing to do the same?
I knew exactly what was supposed to happen, and my word, I think there were about 2 mistakes in the whole thing. But it had all been rehearsed, and I was privileged to be allowed, without telling a soul, to go and watch the rehearsals. So we did know. So there were certain parts where we knew exactly where Richard should come in and go out to fit in with the music and the mood and the pictures.
The moment of the Queen's crowning is come.
God crown you with a crown of glory and righteousness, that having a right faith and manifold fruit of good works, you may obtain the crown of an everlasting kingdom by the gift of him whose kingdom endureth forever. Amen.
The Duke of Cornwall sees his mother crowned.
Some special music had been arranged for when the Queen and Prince Philip left the Abbey, and I felt that it needed something a little more stirring and moving, something very traditional. And I discussed this with the Duke of Norfolk, who, contrary to what a lot of people thought he was very anti-television. In fact, he was extremely helpful. In the end, we had a compromise. The specially arranged music, I think it was by Arthur Bliss, was played between the altar, or processing between the altar and the choir screen, and then the moment they came under the choir screen and we had our head-on shot from the west door, we went into, I think it was Land of Hope and Glory, Pomp and Circumstance. Anyway, there wasn't, I'm sure, a dry eye with any viewer when that happened.
So, to that stirring music, majesty, splendor and beauty pass from our sight as the Queen goes in her lovely robe out of the nave of the Abbey. History has been written and sung here today, in this worn and beautiful old building, where it has been written and sung for many hundreds of years. But never before have so many seen the crowning of the sovereign, or so many shared in her dedication in this Abbey Church, which in its changing forms has sheltered the crowning of our kings and queens for nigh on 1,000 years.
Well, I can only think that that God must have been on our side that day. I mean, the number of things that had gone wrong. There wasn't a camera that went wrong. It was absolutely unbelievable. I know everybody was trying very hard, but trying hard doesn't always produce the result you want.
It was a very long transmission, and we weren't sure, I wasn't sure, that it would sustain, which of course, looking back, was a ridiculous, naive consideration. It did sustain. It set the rules for all the similar events that were to follow.
I suddenly noticed that people were talking about television from that day on. I think it obviously it was growing all the time, but I think this was a moment it launched, or got its launching. It helped tremendously. People living at home near me said, you know, there'd been 30 and 40 round a 9-inch set watching, and it brought home to you how good it was and how powerful it was going to be.
when Peter Dimmock and I went to say goodbye to the Earl Marshal after it was all over and thank him for all he'd done, I remember him saying to us, well, you know very well that I opposed you at the start all I could, but once the die was taken, I wanted to help you. And he said, from all I hear, it was a most marvellous occasion. And I can only say that I suspect now you'll never be refused access anywhere, and sometimes you'll be sorry for the places you find yourself in.
And so, after the great success of the coronation coverage, viewers became used to having a front seat at royal and state events, of seeing the royal family in close-up instead of from a distance in a crowd. Producer for nearly all these great occasions was Anthony Craxton.
Princess Margaret's wedding was, compared with the coronation, comparatively easy. Though none of these broadcasts are easy. We had no restrictions in terms of where we put our cameras. We were able to put them virtually where we wanted, except one looking at the bride and bridegroom from the altar area. Although obviously it was a major occasion and nerve-wracking, from my point of view.
And the commentator for this first full coverage of a royal wedding was again Richard Dimbleby.
I'm standing down on the green grass just outside the north door of the Abbey this morning. People are going by on their way in for the big service. The wedding isn't for an hour and a half. In that hour and a half, and in an hour and a half after that, we shall be continuously with you on the air. How are we going to fill 3 hours, you may well wonder. Well, if you've ever had anything to do with organizing a wedding, you'll know just what's involved. If you'd had anything to do with organizing this wedding, you'd know just what's involved too.
Of course, of the people who went over to television and from sound, the master was Richard Dimbleby. Richard seemed to seize on the medium in a brilliant way. He did his homework. He knew exactly how much to say and how much not to say. And the great problem, of course, coming from radio was you talked too much. And Richard very early grasped the knowledge that you stood back. You dropped the informed comment rather than the description.
He was so good at it because he felt it deeply. He said to me once that he rejoiced in the continuity of things, in the seasons and so forth, and for him, monarchy was one of these recurring symbols of permanence.
He was a journalist. That's an enormous advantage, because he had complete command of the English language. And was poetic at the same time. And I never, in all the broadcasts I did with him, I never heard him say not once. And there was the occasion at Princess Margaret's wedding when we had to wait 50 minutes for Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon to arrive at Tower Pier. And he put on the most remarkable performance of his life, in my view. I had 4 cameras only, Tower Pier, and I looked for everything I could see that made some sort of picture. And Richard wove the whole thing together as if it had been all rehearsed and all followed on sequentially. It was the most remarkable performance. But then, of course, came Princess Alexandra's wedding. And I decided to try a new technique altogether. Instead of following radio's traditional method of having multiple commentators along the route, one at Buckingham Palace, one down the Mall, etc., etc., I decided to try and use Richard for the entire broadcast, which was, 3 hours or more. And he was in a box behind me in a specially constructed area in Westminster Abbey, in the quadrangle. And he saw all the pictures I saw, and therefore was almost one jump ahead of me. He carried out the whole broadcast on his own. Therefore, we had no repetition, which is what you get if you have multiple commentators.
Her, and they go to those fall stools which you see in the background at the entrance to the sanctuary. There the service will be opened by the Dean of Westminster, and the marriage, solemnization itself, carried out by the Archbishop of Canterbury.
I do think you must respect the feelings of those people who are there. And if you have moving cameras in a solemn occasion, people's attention is distracted completely. And therefore unobtrusiveness and good taste are essential to a broadcast of that kind.
And it is as this procession, with its richness and its color and its pride and its intense solemnity and feeling and love, moves down the nave of the huge cathedral, that you will hear the sentences being sung and the funeral service thus beginning.
As far as Churchill's funeral is concerned, it was 6 years in the sense of intense work and agonizing work, because I knew it would be a most moving occasion. And all I can say is that I did my best, but I had Dimbleby.
Four years after Churchill's funeral, a major state occasion was covered in colour for the first time, and there'd been other developments behind the scenes.
Well, the investiture of the Prince of Wales is a rather archaic ceremony, as I think probably Prince Charles would admit. And on this occasion it was held in Carnarvon Castle, which is an open-walled castle, very beautiful, with the sea in the background, a natural amphitheatre. The constable of the castle was Lord Snowdon, and he was responsible for everything that happened within the castle walls. He had decided that this should be a television occasion, though not forgetting the people inside the castle walls. And we did absolutely agree on how it should be done in terms of television. And the fact that he had planned the whole thing with television in mind was an enormous advantage to me and to my colleagues.
I, Charles, Prince of Wales, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship, and faith and truth I will bear unto thee, to live and die against all manner of folks.
Colour added much to the splendour of television's view of the investiture, and in the years that have followed, there have of course been other memorable broadcasts of royal events. But all of them owe much to that successful day in 1953, when television's first intimate gaze upon the sovereign's coronation began a new era of television coverage.